My parents accused me of having evidence that I tried to sleep with my sister's husband, but they shouldn't have believed a worthless person. I never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am, still in shock from the events of the last few months. It all started when my life took a drastic turn, just one day before my final exams. My parents accused me of something unimaginable and kicked me out of the house. I had always believed that we were a very close family, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. My parents were strict, but affectionate in their own way. They had big expectations for us, always encouraging my sister Lisa and me to give our best. Lisa was the perfect daughter, beautiful, smart, and successful. She had everything going for her, including a wonderful husband, Brad, who seemed to be her ideal partner. They got married young, and although they initially lived alone, they ended up moving back into the family home when Brad got a job nearby. My parents were thrilled. They loved having them close, and in a way, so did I. Though it meant I was constantly being compared to my sister, I admired Lisa and was happy to have her around. As for me, I was still in university, and my life was heavily controlled by my parents. My university was nearby, and when I suggested moving into a dorm for more independence, they immediately rejected the idea. "Why spend money on a dorm when you can stay here?" they said. It wasn't just a matter of saving money, it was about control. They liked knowing where I was, who I was with, and what I was doing at all times. They convinced me that it was because they cared, but deep down, I knew it was suffocating. Our house was always full of people, with Lisa and Brad living there. It felt like we were all crammed together, trying to navigate our adult lives while still being treated like children. My parents adored Brad. He was almost like the son they never had. They boasted about him to anyone who would listen, and it was clear that to them he could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, didn't pay much attention to my sister's husband. He had gotten used to being the center of attention after hearing how much my parents were proud of him, and he often asked me why I didn't stay in the dorms. I knew very well that it was my parents' wish that I didn't, but still, I didn't like the judgment I received from my parents, as well as from my sister and her husband, about my decisions. Meanwhile, I was trying to balance my studies, a part-time job, and a long-distance relationship with my boyfriend Mark, who was studying in another state. My parents didn't think much of him, just as they had always compared me to Lisa. Now they did the same with Mark, comparing him to Brad. They never said it openly, but their disapproval was evident in the way they ignored him whenever I mentioned him. Despite the tension, I tried to keep the peace. I helped out at home, cooked, and kept my distance from Lisa and Brad. Lisa and I were never particularly close, but we had a cordial relationship. She was busy with her life, and I was focused on my studies, so our interactions were limited to polite conversations and the occasional family dinner. But everything changed suddenly when my parents called me into the living room, with very serious expressions. It was just before my final exams, and I was stressed and exhausted from all the studying. They said they had something important to discuss, and immediately, I felt a knot in my stomach. They looked at me with disappointment and anger, saying they had found messages on my phone, messages that supposedly proved I was trying to sleep with Brad, my sister's husband. I was completely stunned. They showed me these supposed messages, but they weren't messages I had sent. My name appeared, but I had never texted that man. I tried to explain that I would never, in a million years, think of Brad in that way, especially since I had my own boyfriend whom I loved deeply. But they didn't listen. It was like all the trust we had built over the years vanished in an instant. They accused me of trying to ruin Lisa's marriage and demanded that I leave the house immediately. During this whole conversation, I begged them to let me speak with Brad, but Brad apparently was too affected to talk to me. With nowhere else to go, I called my grandparents, desperate and crying. I told them everything that had happened, showing them that I had no messages and had no interest in Brad, so I was being falsely accused. My grandparents, who had always been kind and understanding, believed me without hesitation. They took me in, gave me a place to stay, and supported me during the worst time of my life. But my father was furious. He didn't like that I was living with my grandparents, saying I wasn't learning my lesson. One day, when I wasn't home, he went to my grandparents' house and confronted them, accusing them of spoiling me and undermining his authority. My grandfather and grandmother defended me, and the argument ended with my father storming off, swearing he would never speak to them again. It broke my heart to see the family falling apart like that. I often felt guilty, thinking that if I hadn't gone to my grandparents, none of this would have happened. But then the unthinkable occurred. My grandfather suddenly passed away. It was devastating. I had never felt such pain in my life. But what hurt the most was that my parents didn't attend his funeral. I could barely keep myself together, trying to manage everything with the help of my boyfriend, Mark, and I also had to take care of my grandmother, who was completely shattered. Her husband was gone, and her son had abandoned her when she needed him the most. A few days later, out of nowhere, my parents appeared at my grandparents' house. I was still grieving, and seeing them only brought out all the anger and pain I had been trying to suppress. I asked them why they hadn't come to the funeral, and they casually said they were out of town. But I knew the truth, they were on vacation. My cousin had seen their post on Facebook and told me everything, but I kept quiet, holding back the urge to confront them. At that point, my boyfriend Mark was also staying with us for a few days, helping me and my grandmother cope with the loss. When he stepped out to see my parents, my father coldly asked why he was there, as if Mark's presence was a problem. That struck a nerve. I had been holding everything together, organizing the funeral, supporting my grandmother, and dealing with my own grief, while my parents were on vacation, ignoring their responsibilities. I felt a surge of anger rise up inside me as I looked at my father, who seemed completely unaware of the pain he had caused. I asked him who he thought had taken care of all the funeral arrangements, who had made sure everything was done right, and who had been there for my grandmother when she needed her family the most. Ideally, he, as her son, should have taken on those responsibilities, but he wasn't there, leaving me to pick up the pieces of our broken family. My father didn't like that one bit. He shot me a reproachful look, clearly offended that I dared question him, and told me to watch my tone, as if I were still the obedient child he could control. But I wasn't that person anymore. Then, almost out of nowhere, his attitude completely shifted. The anger in his eyes vanished, replaced by a disturbing calmness. Suddenly, he became the calmest person in the room, speaking softly and saying he wasn't there to fight. He claimed he wanted to leave everything behind and start over. He even said he was there to forgive me for what had happened with Brad, as if that was something I needed his forgiveness for. Then he mentioned that he would let me stay with my grandmother, but only in exchange for something that belonged to him. I was stunned. A moment ago, he was telling me to watch my tone, and now he was talking about forgiveness and forgetting the past. It didn't make sense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I realized it wasn't about reconciliation. He was there for the inheritance. After everything he had put my grandfather through, the abandonment and betrayal, he was now there for the money. He wasn't interested in making peace or mending our broken relationship. He wanted what he thought was his right, regardless of the damage he had caused. But what he didn't know was that my grandfather had been aware of his intentions. God bless him. He had taken care of everything. A day after the funeral, while we were starting to gather his things, we found a note hidden in one of his drawers. It simply said, "Call Bob." Bob was a lawyer and an old friend of my grandfather's, someone he had visited several times in the past. Although I hadn't paid much attention to him at the time, when we contacted Bob, he informed us that my grandfather had left a will, carefully deciding who would inherit what. Now that I think about it, the moment my father appeared was almost too perfect, as if he knew the will would soon be discussed and wanted to claim his part before that happened. But I must admit, I felt a great sense of satisfaction when I told him that I knew exactly what he was after. He wasn't there to reconcile, to heal our broken family, or even to offer any kind of forgiveness. He was there for my grandfather's savings, for the money he believed was owed to him. But that wasn't going to happen. My grandfather had made sure of that. With a mix of calm and firmness, I told my father that my grandfather had left all his funds to me, every last penny of the savings he had accumulated. As for the house, my grandfather had put it in my grandmother's name, ensuring she would always have a roof over her head, protected from anyone who tried to take it away from her. Initially, my plan was to share this with them when things had settled, when we could perhaps sit down as a family and have a civilized conversation about everything. Maybe, in another world, we could have found a way to reconcile and talk about my grandfather's final wishes with respect and understanding. But that possibility vanished the moment my father walked into the house with his arrogant attitude, thinking he could intimidate us and manipulate us into giving him what he wanted. When I told him about the will, I saw his face twist. For a moment, he was speechless, unable to comprehend that everything he had been waiting for was no longer within his reach. But as quickly as the surprise appeared, it was replaced by anger. He was so narcissistic that he truly believed he had always been there for his parents. He accused me of lying, of manipulating my grandfather into changing the will, as if I had somehow orchestrated the whole thing. The irony was almost laughable, accusing me of being manipulative when he was the one who had abandoned his family for his own greed. But I remained firm. I explained that my grandfather had made these decisions on his own, long before his death, and that Bob, the lawyer, could verify everything I said. There was no conspiracy, no secret plan to exclude him. My grandfather simply knew what my parents' priorities were and acted accordingly to protect what mattered most to him, his wife and his granddaughter. He tried to argue, trying to convince me that I should give him the money he believed was his right as the grandfather's son. But I wouldn't be persuaded. I reminded him that he had already made his decisions, and those decisions had consequences. He had chosen to abandon his father, ignore his responsibilities, and now he was facing the consequences of what he had sown. My mother, who had been silent up until then, also intervened, begging me to reconsider, to find a way to fix things, but it was too late. She didn't react well either. I remember her saying things like, "Wasn't it enough that you tried to steal Lisa's happiness? Now you want to make your father suffer too?" Both of them had shown their true colors, and there was no turning back. My grandfather had made his decision, and I intended to respect it. In the following days, I focused on helping my grandmother adjust to life without my grandfather, making sure she was well taken care of and knew she wasn't alone. Mark stayed with us for a while, helping both of us cope with the loss. Then, just when I thought everything had finally settled down, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Bob, my grandfather's lawyer, and it was addressed to me. I opened it, expecting some final details about the will or maybe a condolence note. But what I found inside was something completely different. The letter explained that my grandfather had set up a trust in my name. This wasn't a surprise. I already knew about the savings he had left me. But what took me by surprise was the condition that came with it. The trust was tied to a property, a house in Florida that my grandfather had quietly bought years ago. According to the letter, the property would remain under my ownership but with one condition. If my parents tried to contest the will or make any legal claims over my grandfather's inheritance, the property would automatically be transferred to them, along with the associated funds. This seemed strange, but there was a twist. The property was nothing more than a run-down house, far from the luxurious inheritance my parents had expected, and the funds were barely enough to cover the taxes and maintenance costs of that property. I stood there in shock, realizing that my grandfather had not only anticipated my parents' greed, but had also set a trap for them. If they tried to contest the will, they wouldn't just lose. They would inherit a financial burden instead of the money they so desperately wanted. A few days later, I received a call from Bob. He informed me that my parents had indeed tried to contest the will. They had hired a lawyer and planned to take the matter to court, convinced they could claim the inheritance they believed was theirs. Bob, in his calm and measured way, explained that as soon as they filed the papers, the trust would activate, and the Florida property, along with all its associated costs, would become their inheritance. With that final move, my grandfather had ensured that any greedy attempts by my parents would backfire, giving them exactly what they deserved, a financial burden instead of the money they had longed for. When the case went to court, it was clear from the start that my parents had no chance. The will was airtight, and Bob had made sure everything was in order, But my parents, blinded by their desire for money, pressed on, thinking they could somehow overturn my grandfather's final wishes. Then, the day the judge dismissed their case, the trust activated, and the Florida property, along with its financial burden, officially became theirs. They were furious, of course, realizing too late that the same man they had tried to betray had outsmarted them. I watched from a distance as they tried to deal with the consequences, attempting to sell the property only to discover that no one wanted to buy a rundown house with a mountain of debt attached to it. Their financial situation quickly deteriorated, and they found themselves trapped in a disaster of their own making. In a way, it was the ultimate poetic justice. My grandfather had managed to protect my grandmother and me from their greed, even from beyond the grave. And although I never took pleasure in their suffering, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. Now my father is angry, but instead of backing down, he started apologizing to me, trying to paint himself as the victim. He claimed he was simply misunderstood and that they only wanted what was rightfully theirs. My mother has also been constantly sending texts and voice messages, trying to sweeten everything, talking about how families fight but always find their way back, how Grandpa would want us to be united, and how she just wants to leave the past behind. But their actions speak louder than their words, and it's clear they haven't really changed. They're not interested in reconciliation. They're interested in finding a way to recover the money they lost. The worst part is that they've dragged Lisa and Brad into their scheme. Suddenly, my sister and her husband are trying to communicate with me, playing the role of mediators. They say all the right things, talking about family and how we need to be united, but none of it interests me. It's all part of the game. Lisa, who had barely spoken to me since the accusation, now acts like she cares about fixing our relationship. They all expect that if they manage to make me feel guilty, I'll cave and offer them part of the trust. They're trying to wear me down, making me feel like I'm the one keeping the family divided, that it's my fault that we're all separated. But the reality is, none of their messages matter to me. I even find it amusing, always waiting for the moment they reach out to see what absurd thing they have to say. Because, at the end of the day, all they can do is that, reach out. We went to court, and they lost. So their last move is to try to make me feel guilty, which they're not succeeding at. But I didn't come here just to tell my story. I know this subreddit has certain rules, and I need to ask, am I the bad one for wanting to keep what my grandfather left me, even if that means turning my back on my family? Update 1. For a couple of days after my parents' visit, everything was surprisingly quiet, which made me a bit sad because I was counting on their messages to entertain me. I told myself that they had finally accepted the situation and decided to move on, but deep down, I still hoped they would come back with something more ridiculous that would make me laugh. Sure enough, just when I started to think things might stay silent, I received an email from my father. The tone of the message was quite amusing. Not only was he angry, but he was filled with resentment and a sense of entitlement that blinded him. He wrote that he knew all of my grandfather's money rightfully belonged to him, and that I was nothing but a thief for keeping it. He continued by saying that I was supposed to be a decent person and do the right thing by handing it all over to him. Then, as if to add insult to injury, he brought up Brad again, saying that he would graciously forgive me for what I had done if I gave him the money. But if I didn't, he warned me that I would face serious consequences. This was no longer just about money. It was about control, power, and his need to dominate everyone around him, even if it meant destroying his own daughter in the process. As if that wasn't enough, I started hearing from family friends and distant relatives that my parents had been spreading all sorts of rumors about me. They were calling me a homewrecker, implying that I had tried to destroy Lisa's marriage and that I was some sort of manipulative gold digger. The irony was, what fortune were they talking about? Brad lived with his in-laws because it was cheaper. Although I didn't judge that before, I certainly did now. The lies were laughable because they really showed how far they were willing to go. They were trying to ruin my reputation, painting me as the villain in this twisted story they had created. It was as if they wanted to make me out to be the bad guy, hoping that if they said it enough times, people would start to believe it. I knew I couldn't handle this alone, or rather, I didn't want to deal with it on my own. So I contacted the big guns. I called Bob, my grandfather's lawyer, to see if there was anything he could do. I sent him an email and explained everything that had been going on. When we talked, Bob was calm and reassured me, but he didn't sugarcoat the situation. He told me that unfortunately my father might try to take the matter to court. Legally, he had the right to contest the will, especially if he claimed that my grandfather had been manipulated or wasn't in full control of his faculties when he made his decisions. It was a weak argument, but enough to drag us into a long legal battle if my father decided to pursue the case. The good news, Bob said, was that my father didn't have much to work with. My grandfather's will was solid, and we had plenty of evidence to prove that he was fully aware and in control when he made his decisions. Even though my father didn't have a strong case, the stress, legal costs, and the possibility of more lies and defamation were enough to make me feel trapped. So here I am, preparing for whatever comes next. I've started gathering all the documents and evidence I might need if this goes to trial. I've also started recording every message, every email, every voicemail my parents send me. Bob said all of this could be important if we need to prove harassment or an intent to defame. Maybe it's not as funny as it sounds, but I'm ready to face them. And when I say ready, I mean I'm prepared to drag them through the mud to show them what I'm capable of if they keep bothering me. Update 2. What happened in the last few days was something I didn't expect at all. One morning, Lisa showed up at our door completely unexpectedly. I braced myself for a confrontation, ready to face all the accusations she might throw at me. But instead of anger, what I saw was a shattered woman. She looked exhausted with red eyes from crying so much. Before I could even ask what was going on, she broke down in tears. Her body trembled as she tried to speak between sobs. She told me what had happened. Brad, her husband, had supposedly been on a work trip. Lisa, wanting to surprise him, decided to visit him without notice. But when she arrived at the hotel, she found him with another woman. She confronted him right there, screaming at him, demanding answers, asking him how he could do this to her. In the midst of the confrontation, she threw all the accusations she could think of at him, including the one that had torn our family apart. She asked him if he had really ever thought that I was flirting with him, and it was then that Brad, trying to salvage whatever little dignity he had left, finally confessed the truth. It wasn't me. It never was. The messages Lisa had seen, the ones that made her accuse me of trying to steal her husband, were actually from one of his many affairs. He had saved the woman's number under my name to avoid suspicion. As Lisa was telling me this, my mind was spinning. All the pain, all the suffering, all the damage caused by one man's lies, the fact that my parents believed him and turned against me without even considering the possibility that I was innocent, was like a knife twisting in my chest again. But what Lisa told me afterward was even more heartbreaking. After discovering Brad's betrayal, she went to our parents, hoping they would support her, that they would stand by her while she dealt with the mess her marriage had become. But instead of comfort, they told her she needed to fix things with Brad. In fact, they advised her to forgive him, to let it go and move on, as if his infidelity were just a small bump in the road. They were more concerned about their son-in-law than their daughter's happiness. Lisa was furious that our parents could be so insensitive, so blind to what their daughters were going through. The proof was that they were pressuring her to stay in a toxic relationship to keep that useless man in the family. It wasn't much different from what I had gone through, being kicked out for them to maintain a relationship with him. Lisa couldn't stop apologizing, saying she was sorry for everything, for not believing me, for allowing Brad and our parents to manipulate her. She said she didn't know who else to turn to, and that she felt trapped, alone, and completely lost. I didn't know what to say to her. I had no words because she was my sister, and she had chosen to believe someone else. There wasn't much I could do for her at this point. Feeling alone and completely lost is how I felt, and now she was living the same thing. If only she had supported me, or at least listened, maybe she would have discovered her husband's infidelity earlier, and we wouldn't have lost a sister. There's not much I can do for her now, and as for our parents, I don't know what will happen now that the truth about Brad has come to light. I wonder if they will change their attitude, considering all their manipulations were based on this. We'll see what happens next. Update 3. Things have started to calm down. Lisa has begun the divorce process to get rid of Brad. That doesn't fix things between us, but it's what she needed to do. On a positive note, my parents finally did what they should have done a long time ago. They kicked Brad out of their house. He's no longer living there, and honestly, that's a relief. It's frustrating that it took them so long to see the truth, but at least it finally happened. In a surprising turn, my dad actually reached out to my grandmother and apologized for everything. His absence during my grandfather's funeral, the way he treated me, and the tension he caused for all of us. He assured my grandmother that he wanted to make up for his mistakes and try to repair the damage he caused. However, my grandmother was firm with him. She reminded him that while the apology was welcome, it didn't change the fact that he would receive neither the money nor the house. What surprised me most was that my father accepted this without any argument. It felt like a small victory, although I still have my reservations about his true intentions. Just a day ago, my grandmother mentioned something important to me. She said she wanted to make sure her will was in order. She hasn't shared this with the rest of the family, but she confided in me that she plans to leave the house to Lisa. I'm not sure how to feel about this, but it's her house, and she can do whatever she wants with it. Looking back at everything that's happened has made me reconsider what family really means. It's not just about blood or tradition, it's about the people who stand by you when things get tough, the ones who believe in you even when others don't. My relationship with my parents may never be the same, but I'm okay with that. I have my grandmother and the support of those who truly care about me. So I think this could be the last update. Things are far from perfect, but we are all finding our way forward. I don't know what will happen with Lisa and my parents, whether they'll really be able to change, but I have no intention of finding out. Update 4 to start. My father has been trying to deal with the disaster that is the property in Florida. Of course, his approach to fixing the problem was peculiar, to say the least. With the burden of debt and a house in deplorable condition, he decided to go there to see for himself the real state of things. The logical thing would have been to try and find a rational way to get rid of the property after seeing the disaster firsthand, but instead, things took a completely absurd turn. Apparently, when he arrived in Florida and saw the house in its ruinous state, the situation was even worse than he expected. I don't know what he had in mind when he went, but what he did next was seriously an act of pure frustration or stupidity, depending on how you look at it. That same night, after drinking at a local bar, he decided that his brilliant plan was to crash his car into the house. Yes, you read that right. He apparently thought it would be quicker or cheaper than dealing with the formal demolition process. It's as if the frustration and alcohol led him to a complete loss of sanity. Luckily, no one else was hurt in the crash. However, my father sustained injuries and had to spend a few days in the hospital. This forced my mother to travel to Florida to take care of him and bring him back home. Once he was out of the hospital, it seems like he finally realized the reality of the property and its condition. But by then, it was too late. This doesn't surprise me, given that his obsession with the inheritance blinded him completely at the time, leading him to sign everything without asking any questions about what he was actually getting. It just goes to show how greed can be truly blinding. On the other hand, for those wondering, my sister has finalized her divorce from her ex-husband, Brad. Honestly, I have no idea where he is now. He's probably still out there being the same manipulative, egocentric bastard as always. So, in summary, this has been my life lately.